arrived today amid concerns for frontline medics.
Doctors are extremely afraid that they are not adequately protected. Now, this is completely understandable. This is a highly contagious virus.
The questions for the government over its pandemic response after claims Borris Johnson failed to act fast enough in minimising the impact.
The idea that the Prime Minister skipped meetings that were vital to our response to the coronavirus, I think is grotesque.
Calls for clarity as the government stays silent on its lockdown exit strategy. And One World Together, the stars performed from their living rooms in a show of support for frontline workers. Good morning. A delivery of desperately needed protective kits for frontline NHS staff has been delayed and will not be arriving in the UK today. It adds to growing concern for the safety of medics and healthcare workers, following warnings some hospitals could run out of PPE within hours. Around 84 tonnes was expected to arrive in the UK from Turkey, including 400,000 surgical gowns. The government is already under fire this morning following accusations it didn't act quick enough to stem the impact of the coronavirus crisis. Earlier, Senior Cabinet Minister Michael Gove confirmed a crucial consignment was expected just hours before it was postponed.
It's the first priority of government and of my colleague Matt Hancock and I to ensure that we protect those on the front line who are doing so much to keep the rest of us safe. It is the case that there's a consignment of personal protection equipment that's arriving from Turkey, which contains tens of thousands of gowns. It's also the case that we have a deal with China in order to bring in due course some 25 million gowns over to the United Kingdom in order to make sure that people are kept safe.
Well, Dr. Chang Nagpal, chair of the British Medical Association, said frontline workers are already concerned.
Doctors are extremely afraid that they are not adequately protected. Now, this is completely understandable. This is a highly contagious virus. Doctors are looking after patients extremely close proximity, inches away sometimes. We know that that about 50% of doctors are telling us that they don't feel they have the adequate protection to prevent them getting infected. That's extremely scary for any healthcare worker.
Well, Sky's political correspondent Rob Powell joins me now from Westminster. Rob, the government's once again under fire.
Yeah, and I think the fact that this shipment of protective equipment that was due in the UK today from Turkey is now not arriving, while it may not be necessarily the government's fault, it is still embarrassing for the government, because yesterday, when they were coming under pressure over protective equipment and shortages specifically of gowns for NHS workers, Robert Jemrick, the Community Secretary, in the press conference yesterday pointed specifically towards this shipment of 84 tonnes of equipment with 400,000 gowns that was due to arrive today. Indeed, as you heard there, Michael Gove just a few hours ago said that this was due to come in. Now, we understand this isn't an issue with the UK side transport or logistics. That's ready to go. It's about the actual stock and supply being ready. Now, on Friday night, we heard from NHS providers that represents NHS trusts. They said that gowns would be potentially running out in the next 24 to 48 hours in some hospitals and NHS trusts across the country. And that was because there weren't enough in the reserve stock that's held to prepare for a pandemic like this. Now, the government pointed towards this incoming shipment as a way to replace those shortages. That will now not come in. We're told it's a delay, not necessarily a cancellation, so we should expect to see it at some point, but no exact timescale for when this is coming in.
The idea that the Prime Minister skipped meetings that were vital to our response to the coronavirus, I think is grotesque. The truth is that there are meetings across government, some which are chaired by the Health Secretary, some which are chaired by other ministers, but the Prime Minister took all the major decisions. And I think anyone who considered what happened to the Prime Minister just a little while ago, nobody can say that the Prime Minister wasn't throwing heart and soul into fighting this virus.
And Rob, what more do we know about this issue with PPE? We're expecting a shipment to arrive in the UK from Turkey. What's the latest on that?
Yeah, that, as I was saying, that is now not going to arrive. So a lot of pressure on the government. Michael Gove just there was responding to allegations, reports, facts really, actually, that Boris Johnson had not attended 5 COBRA meetings back in February. Now, at the time, Number 10 made no secret of the fact that Boris Johnson was not at these COBRA meetings. They were chaired by the Health Secretary. Matt Hancock, the Prime Minister's spokesperson, said that Boris Johnson was being kept informed by advisers and the Chief Medical Officer throughout, and that the first COBRA was the 6th one, and that was the one that the Prime Minister chaired. So I think this is an argument about whether the PM necessarily needed to be there, but it comes alongside other accusations made by the Sunday Times investigative team this morning about how well prepared the government was. I think there will be increasing focus on this probably in the months and years ahead. I think the scientific advisers around the government will probably also come under a lot of scrutiny. In terms of what the Prime Minister's doing now, he is still at Chequers, recovering from COVID-19. Of course, he was discharged from hospital a week ago now, although we are told today that he has begun directing ministers, so taking some sort of leadership role within the government's response to this pandemic. Of course, the big decision coming up for him now, as well as these ongoing challenges around protective equipment and testing, is about when and how to ease the lockdown. Now, today, one government advisor, Sir Jeremy Farrar, who's director of the Wellcome Trust, but feeds into the SAGE group, that feeds into the information given to government, said that he thought that the lockdown measures should be eased as soon as possible because of the damage they were doing, but made it clear that that needed to be data-driven and couldn't be set by an arbitrary date from government. So a lot on the government's plate, a lot of criticism, a lot of pressure, and a lot of challenges.
OK, Rob, thank you. Well, the former Conservative Party leader Iain Duncan Smith says the government must put its trust in the public as it plans its next steps. And he joins me now. Many thanks indeed for joining me today, Mr. Duncan Smith. Firstly,
Morning.
Do you think mistakes have been made?
No, I think I'm going to come back to this report. Honestly, I would advise caution on this news story because, first of all, we've got to get this into context. The reality about this was that the world did not realize the extent of the pandemic in China because it is quite clear now that China suppressed and hid information for whatever reasons we may yet discover, and that the World Health Organization, which has serious questions to answer, did not tell the rest of the world that this was a pandemic that was more than likely to spread.
With respect, Mr. Duncan Smith, let me interject there. I'm asking the questions, Mr. Duncan Smith. I'm asking the questions. I am asking the questions, Mr. Duncan Smith.
Let me finish this
I
point,
am asking the questions.
The reality
if you let me interject there.
You've asked me a question. Let me finish
But what
the
you're saying
answer.
strictly isn't true,
No,
is it?
let me
You said
finish
the World Health Organization didn't inform the world about the threats. That's not true, is it? They told the world about the threats in January, so we were clear as to the dangers facing the country as early as January. Is that right or is that wrong?
No, that is wrong. The reality is that the World Health Organization did not interrogate China as they should have done about the release of the data. And most countries in the West were certain that this was under control in China. It turns out that it was not. That is the biggest problem. The second bit about this, which is quite critical, is that right now, every single country in the world is looking for exactly the same equipment. PPE equipment is exactly the point. Every other country is much in the same boat. It's not as though the UK is suddenly isolated in this. Every other country is having to cope with what is an unprecedented pandemic. And the point I'm trying to make, where you're interrupting me, was that this is a process which the government is trying desperately to get on top of and has been since the beginning. There are questions, yes, that will be asked, but later on, not now. We have no idea who's leaking this information, whether they're disgruntled or not. We don't know. But the reality is, questions will be asked, but it's right to ask them once we've completed this process, got on top of this, and then managed to get the country back up and running, which is absolutely fine.
OK, it is also right and fair to ask, though, whether a global emergency was declared weeks ago.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
It is right and fair for me to ask whether a global emergency was declared weeks ago by the World Health Organization.
It's quite right for you to ask questions, but the question here is really important. Is the government doing the right thing? Is it trying desperately, quite rightly, to obtain PPE equipment Is it trying to support our frontline staff? Yes, the answer to those questions are yes. But is every other country doing exactly the same? Yes, that is the problem. This pandemic is on unprecedented scale, and every country is in exactly the same place, trying to get the same equipment from the same suppliers. This is the key problem. In Italy, in Spain, in France, in Germany, and in America, every country is in the same boat. So what I'm asking is we get a bit of context on this and understand that the information about this should have been out much earlier than just the end of January. It should have been out in December, when the real data was known that this was a serious problem and was spreading.
But if by late February scientists were warning policymakers that the UK could suffer 380,000 deaths without urgent intervention, it's fair to ask whether the government could have addressed this more aggressively, and also whether the government should have been sending PPE to China.
Well, again, let's put this in context. The government was all the advice that was given to them by the medical professionals and by the scientists. They have followed exactly to the letter. That is critical. Now, the whole point about this PPE point, get that again in context. At the time, we were understanding that China was getting under control on this issue, and therefore support from many other countries, not just the UK, to try and help China contain this. We did not know at the time that the data on this was far more extensive and should have been released. But however, that was trying to contain it in China, not let it spread. It turns out, because people were still moving out of China, that had already begun to spread. Once that was known, this government, other governments in France and all these other countries, then had to take the advice of the scientists in how to control it. And I think the government did do exactly what they were asked. We will learn later on exactly what was said to them and what they did. But my belief is, from talking to ministers, they followed the scientific and medical advice from start to finish. And now we must plan for a moment when we can start moving out and get the economy so that it is working again. Otherwise, the damage will be enormous.
OK, as I said in my introduction, you were once the leader of the Conservative Party. If you had once upon a time been the Prime Minister, would you have missed 5 COBRA meetings after the alarm bells had been raised?
Well, COBRA is a set of letters standing for Cabinet Office Briefing Room A. COBRA meetings take place all the time. Most of them are functional and planning meetings. When I was in Cabinet, the Prime Minister did not attend every single planning meeting.
But would you expect the Prime Minister to attend a COBRA meeting in the grips of a global emergency?
I would expect him to have delegated to those relevant Secretaries of State to run those areas that were meeting in the COBRA room. The key point here is the Prime Minister attends when it needs all of those departments to be pulled together for a particular function. I believe he did that. The key element is each of the Secretaries of State working together is responsible. One of them normally takes a lead at a meeting like that when it's planning. So if it's a health lead, then they will have all the other relevant Secretaries of State round the table and they will take the lead on it. The Prime Minister comes in when it requires an executive decision about something which has up till then not been decided. So it is normal for a Prime Minister not to be at COBRA meetings, only when his presence is absolutely vital, because that's what you pay Secretaries of State for, to do their job and to run their departments and to coordinate activity.
Well, so you also paid the Prime Minister to do his job, in all fairness, Mr. Duncan Smith. With hindsight, should events like the Cheltenham races, which saw 250 people gather together in one place over the course of 4 days, should that have taken place?
It depends what the advice was. If the scientific advice and medical advice, as I understand it was, and I wasn't there, but as I understand it was, that it was okay to continue with those events at that time. So that is the critical issue. Did the government listen to the advice? I believe they did, but we will know later on whether that was the case or not. But I believe they did listen to that advice, and that advice was they were okay to go ahead at the time. Now, we may, in hindsight, say, well, the figures that were around, maybe that shouldn't have been the case. But the question for government, which you keep asking, is what advice did the government follow? And the government has made it clear they followed scientific and medical advice from their scientific advisors and their medical advisors. And I think that's the critical question.
Once the dust has finally settled and we are through this pandemic, would you welcome an inquiry to investigate what went wrong?
There will always be an inquiry to figure out what went right and what went wrong, and that will happen. My point here today is to try and undertake that now on the backs of leaks and suggestions from others, we don't know who they are, would be a mistake. What we need to recognize is the lockdown is working. We need to make sure that happens. We need to help and support the government in trying to get as much PPE equipment in as other countries are trying to do at the same time, and to get through this so that we can, as I've set out, plan to get the economy moving in a three-phase process once we've got this under control. That's the critical bit. We should be talking to the public, saying there is a way out of this, here is how it is, and let's trust them to understand the difference between a lockdown measure and the fact that at some point we'll be coming out. That's the critical question.
Also the critical question is that we don't know exactly how long it is before the restrictions are going to be completely lifted.
No, not at the moment. But the key question for us is, at what point do we think it's going to be okay to be able to start moving the economy back out? And I think if you look at the other countries that are doing it, they're doing it at about the level of half peak of those who are arriving in hospitals, etc. That may be a target figure, but the government will have to figure that out under medical advice. But the key bit is, let's set out what the plan will be so the public, businesses and others can start to plan for when we move out. They'll know how it'll be done.
Iain Duncan Smith, many thanks indeed for your time. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Now, hopes that coronavirus antibody test